Welcome to the lab RecoverPoint with VNX Installation. In this lab, what we'll cover is how to install a virtual RPA and then how to install a RecoverPoint with VNX cluster using Deployment Manager. So our first step will be to deploy the OVA file. So first we want to select an ESX host to host our virtual RPA. We want to verify that the networks are correct. And we want to verify that it has a data store that's large enough to deploy the virtual RPA on. So once we have done that, what we can do is we can use our vSphere client logged into vCenter server. We can go to File and we can go to Deploy OVF Template. Now, from here we can browse to the template location. Now this is the file for the virtual RPA. Notice it's got the version in the file name. So we downloaded this from support.emc.com and now we can deploy this virtual machine. So we select it. It gives us the OVF details. Notice it does give us the version number. It tells us the size on the disk and a description. So we click Next and accept the ELA, and then we can click Next. And from here we can give it a name. So this is the name in vCenter server, not necessarily the name of the virtual RPA once it's installed. We want to make sure that we easily identify both the cluster and whether it's RPA 1, 2, or so on. And then we click Next. The next step will be to choose a profile based on the needs and performance of our RPA. And then we're going to pick a data store for which to install the virtual machine on. So here we pick thin provisioning and click Next. And now what we're going to do is we're going to match up the virtual switches that are configured on the ESX server to the virtual interfaces on the vRPA. So as you can see, we have a WAN, a LAN, Iscuzzy 1, and Iscuzzy 2. Now we're going to connect those to a virtual switch that is configured on the ESX server. So what we want to do is match up all four of these virtual interfaces. And then we're done, click Next. And what we're going to set is a fixed IP address. So we're going to give this virtual RPA, once it powers on, it will have this temporary IP address on the LAN or management port. And we're going to give it the IP address and a subnet mask. And we're going to assign a temporary DNS server and a temporary gateway. Select power on after deployment and click Finish. And after the virtual machine is created, it should power on and we can verify that it did. So I've sped this up obviously a little bit. So we want to go to the console and we want to see if we get the login prompt. We don't actually have to log in here, but we just want to make sure that's a good indication that the RPA has successfully booted correctly. Now that our RPAs are both configured, we can launch RecoverPoint Deployment Manager. So to launch it, we click on the executable and it will launch. Notice it's self-updating. So we can at this point we want to say no because we have the latest release. We want to select RecoverPoint 4.0 or later, and in our example we're going to select other operations. Now we could also do a customer installation, in which case it would just lead us to the menu for RecoverPoint with VNX Installation. But from here we're going to log in as an EMC employee, and we're going to select RecoverPoint with VNX. In our example, we have a VNX, not a VNXi. So now that we have selected RecoverPoint for or RecoverPoint with VNX installer, we're going to click Next, and notice we get this kind of confirmation just to make sure that we're installing a cluster with the correct wizard. Obviously, without the correct wizard, you'll have issues with licensing. So we have read the prerequisites and click Next. And here, this is a configuration file that we can name so that way, if we have to stop the installation for any reason, we can start it back up at where we left off. Now we're going to enter in the environment settings. So first of all, cluster name can be entered here. Also, here is where we select the number of RPAs. Obviously, this will affect the rest of the wizard. Now we're just going to enter in the information. Most of it's fairly self-explanatory. We're going to enter in a DNS server, a secondary DNS server, and an NTP server. Also take note of the LAN and the WAN IPv4 and MTU size. So in our example here, we have already set the IP addresses for the RPAs. Now, if desired, you can select a discovery method where it will go out and discover the IP addresses for you if you have a DHCP server. But in our example, we're going to use set the IP addresses, and what we're going to do is enter those IP addresses here. So we'll begin by entering in the cluster management IP address. Now this will be used for the cluster, and no matter how many RPAs you always have one cluster management address. We'll enter in the net mask for both the WAN and the LAN interfaces. And we're going to enter in the management IP address of RPA1 and then RPA2. So those IP addresses, they must match the temporary IP addresses that are configured on the RPA right now. We're going to enter in the default gateway. So this is for the management gateway. And if you notice that there are additional gateways for the WAN. So we're going to enter in the WAN IP address for RPA1 and RPA2. So now we're going to add an additional gateway. Think of this as sort of like a static route. You're going to add a gateway, the target net mask, and the target subnet. So once we've completed entering in the information on this page, we're going to click Next and move on. Next, we enter in the default password for the box management account, which is BOXMGMT. Once we've done that, we can click next. So when we click next, what will happen is that the deployment manager will go out and log into the RPAs using the IP address that we assigned, and it will apply the configuration to the RPAs based on the information that we supplied. So what will happen now is, as you can see, you get green checks and you get the version of RecoverPoint software that each RPA is running, and it makes sure that the application of settings works fine. So the next screen is for configuring the Iscuzzy interfaces of the virtual RPAs. So this will only appear if we have selected, or if we are using virtual RPAs. Here we can configure chat credentials, and we can change the IP type from IP4 to IP6. So we're going to click next, and what we're going to do is we're going to enter in the information for our Iscuzzy ports. In other words, we need 4 IP addresses in our example, 2 for each RPA. And we're going to enter in a net mask for Iscuzzy 1 and Iscuzzy 2, and we're going to enter an IP address for each of the Iscuzzy interfaces. Also, at this time, note that you can add an additional gateway if required. So now, once we have entered in all the information on this page about the Iscuzzy ports, we can click next to continue. Now what we're going to be able to do here is enter in login credentials for emcsupport.com. Now, if this host that's running the deployment manager cannot connect to emcsupport.com, you can use what's called an offline installation change management file, which must be obtained from EMC support. So we're going to demonstrate this, and we're going to select one that we have previously and click next. Now comes the option where we are going to be able to update the release of code that's running on the particular RPAs. You can update that locally through a DVD or USB device or an FTP server, or you can choose not to update at this time. So once we're all set, now we have the latest version in our example here. So we're just going to click next. And what comes next is based on the file that we added, are the change management messages that we need to read. And of course, after we read them, you can click on them to see the message, the blue links. And once they are read, of course, we need to check the box for each one, and then we're able to click next. Now it's going to apply those configuration settings to the RPA at this time. So as you can see here, the settings were applied correctly, and the installation was completed successfully. So we'll click next. The next screen at the top, RPA Communication Security, which has 3 different levels. This is for security over the WAN between clusters. Doesn't affect Fibre Channel and won't affect if it's just a local cluster. Also, we can configure user security. So there is basic and then there is high. Plus, we are also allowed to change the predefined passwords. We're going to set them to both accessible and basic and click next. And as you can see, it's configuring the settings that we chose. Next, we're going to enter in the IP address of the VNX that we're going to use for our installation. So we're going to enter in the IP address of SPA and the IP address of SPB, along with the username and password. So once we have entered in all the information, including the username, password, and IP address, and of course the scope, we can click Next. Now, Deployment Manager will go out and log in to the VNX. And what it's going to perform is it's going to perform registration of our Iscuzzy interfaces for our virtual RPAs. Now it does a quick scan diagnostic. Notice it found some warnings. Now these are not errors, they're just warnings. And in this example, it's because we have other RecoverPoint clusters sharing this VNX, which of course is perfectly allowable. So we're going to click Next. And what we're going to do is enter the array name. Now the array name is very important because it must be unique for this array from a RecoverPoint point of view. And next we could also configure CHAP, and we can configure the number of Iscuzzy ports on the VNX, and we must enter the IP addresses of the two VNX ports, as we chose two in our example, for our VNX. So these must be already configured on the VNX. So now we can see that the configuration is being applied and that it was successful. So what we'll do is we'll click Next, and now the wizard will run a SAN diagnostics test in which it will check connectivity to the VNX. That was successfully completed, so we know our Iscuzzy connections are good. Now if there was an error, we could have clicked Refresh. So notice we have two options here to provision the repository volume. We could do it automatically, which means it would actually create a LUN, or we could manually provision from a LUN already created. So in our example, we're going to select manually provision and click Next. And what we'll get is, once it'll go out, if you look, it's reading the volume information, and it lists all the volumes on the VNX. So one thing you want to be careful of course, is to obviously pick the correct volume, because RecoverPoint will format it. So we want to make sure that this is not a production volume. So we're going to pick a 5.72 gig volume and click Next. So now Deployment Manager will go out to the VNX, and it will register the initiators from the RPA. In this case, they're Iscuzzy initiators. It will create a storage group, and it will place the repository in that storage group, and then the RecoverPoint cluster will install, in other words, attach to the cluster of the RPAs. They'll reboot, and when it comes back, you will get the final green check, and the RecoverPoint with VNX cluster will be installed. So you can see here that concluded our RecoverPoint with VNX installation. Now our RecoverPoint cluster is ready to use. This concluded our lab RecoverPoint with VNX installation. So what we covered was how to install the virtual RPAs and how to use Deployment Manager to configure RecoverPoint with VNX.